Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around. My name's Eric Gjede, Vice President of Public Policy at CBIA. It's obviously great to be back in an in-person HR conference. It's a lot better when I'm reacting to the facial expressions rather than just the camera that I've had the past couple of times we've done this. So it's great to see you all again. Certainly have missed you all. Now, if you're looking ahead on some of my slides, you're probably getting a little bit of deja vu. They probably look a lot like Attorney Anthony's slides, but like a lot less comprehensive and a lot less well written. Well, both of those aspects are true. But what I'm here to do today is to tell you a little bit about some of the missing pieces that some of the earlier presenters have not touched upon, and give you a little bit about why things happened the way they did. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we've been working on since the end of the legislative session, which was in June of this year, and then give you a little sneak preview on what is on the minds of some of Connecticut's businesses and what we might be seeing in 2022. Well, there we go. So, it's really important, I think, to remind you to where we were at the beginning of 2021. So I'm going to take you back in time a little bit. Now, at this time, obviously, businesses had really been struggling. Many had been shut down for months at a time, just a few months before the legislative session started in January. Vaccines just starting to become available. You know, we've heard that there might be some more federal money coming our way, but we weren't real sure at that point in time. Obviously, massive number of unemployment claims out there. And the idea of social equity was really starting to really come out there and was going to be the driver behind everything up at the Capitol. That was really clear. And also, there was a whole bunch of brand new elected legislators, all freshmen, so we had no clue what any of these people's personal issues were, what their what things they would want to be working on. So, in short, it was a pretty scary situation for those of us in government affairs. And further, make it even more scary for us is that we didn't have any access to the legislative office building, So it's very easy for a lawmaker throughout the legislative session to just ignore my phone call. A lot easier than it is to ignore me when I'm waiting for you outside the bathroom, which I, from time to time, have to do at the Capitol. So thankfully, a bunch of things over the next few months started to fall in our favor. Billions of federal dollars start pouring into the state of Connecticut. CBIA had built up a lot of goodwill going into the elections, which really started to pay off. Some of the lawmakers' antics ended up diminishing their ability to get some things done, and I'll just leave it at that. A few of the strategies that we kind of fell into really seemed to go our way, and we'll talk about one of those a little bit later. And so why don't I get into some of the details of what actually happened, but I'm going to move very quickly because you've heard most of this throughout the day. So, all right, graduation dates on job applications. So I'm going to start, first of all, I should let you know, I'm going to start with some of the changes to law that I personally feel were relatively minor. You may disagree, but we're going to, again, move through those very quickly, and I'm not going to rehash everything you just heard, because I know, like I said, this was covered. So this idea, this graduation dates on job applications, obviously to deal with age discrimination, or at least that's the goal. And it was originally pushed by an organization that has been behind some of the biggest labor mandates in the state over the past couple of years. This group was one of the key people or key organizations behind the retirement mandate that's about to go into effect. Passed a few years ago, they just haven't really gotten it all the way to the point where they can fully launch it. They were also critical in the passage of the Paid Family Medical Leave Act that I know we are all struggling with right now. And I'm not going to name the organization, but it is an association that has 4 letters. They represent retired people, specifically American ones. So we were brought in to negotiate with this group, and thankfully we were brought in so early because they were trying to push this a lot farther there than where we ended up at the end of the day. They wanted to ban even the use of words in job postings like, needs to be a digital native. Now, I had no clue what that even meant at the time. I do understand what that is now, but we were able to stop them from adding stuff like that and being much more expansive, getting it to where you see it today. But again, I think I'm telling you this because I see that this will continue to be an issue that is up at the Capitol in the future. Nursing mother accommodation. So this is a perfect example of a piece of legislation that is crafted for the sole purpose of being a wedge issue. So no, both parties do this. It's not any one party that has that does this all the time or has a monopoly on this. But basically, it's an opportunity. You throw a bill out there that you really want the other side to vote against because it's going to be great. And what better thing to have the other side be against than being anti-mother? I mean, that's like the worst thing you could do, right? The only problem is that no one really thought this was that big of a deal. Both Republicans, they really wanted the Republicans and business community to come out and just trash on this, but we were just kind of like, yeah, that really kind of seems reasonable. I think we could do that. So it quickly passed and became law, and again, I don't think it's that big of a deal at all in this day and age. This one was touched on much better than I could do in an earlier presentation a couple speakers ago, so why don't we get right into the recreational marijuana issue. I know this had its own full segment this morning, and so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I can tell you, CBIA's position on the recreational marijuana issue is like, we really don't like it, but if you're going to do it like every other state has done it, and at least allow us to continue to operate drug-free workplaces if that's what we choose to do. And that's after a lot of work, believe me. That is where we ended up, pretty much. So one of my colleagues just spent an enormous amount of time working on this issue and ensuring that protection was in place. But I think he was also the beneficiary of the fact that this bill, probably more than any other, was bogged down by that social equity issue. And the reason is there is massive amounts of money dealing with this bill. So there was everyone fighting for a piece of this pie. Organized labor wanted to make sure that if you started a recreational marijuana dispensary, you could not fight unionization at all. The minority marijuana business associations wanted to make sure that this was the licenses for these facilities were going to go to the communities where the war on drugs had impacted them the most. All of the existing medical marijuana distributors, they were all fighting because they're already in the industry. Nobody knows better how to do it than they do. They wanted their piece of the action too. So with all of this fighting going on, that was the key issue, was who, so we were kind of able to operate a little bit in the background here. Now, they could not get their act together. And I don't know if you've ever been up to the state capitol on a day where the folks who were testifying in favor of recreational marijuana are testing, but if you ever have, you can understand why they couldn't get a whole lot done on time. Anyway, so it was questionable whether they were ever going to get it passed, but again, we were able to make sure that protections were in place for the business community. I think the biggest question with this bill is, how are social attitudes towards the recreational marijuana issue going to pass? I mean, these industries, they're very high tech. They're coming into communities throughout the state, or they're going to be soon. They are spending a ton of money to build state-of-the-art facilities all over the place, and they are hiring a ton of people and paying really good wages. So it's really going to be interesting to watch over the next few years to see how this sort of develops. Okay, the previous speaker again also talked about the workers' compensation impact. Again, this was going to be a social equity issue, all geared towards those frontline workers, specifically those in our grocery stores and other retailers. The big problem for the people pushing for like a presumption that you got you got the virus in your workplace. And then you were being denied your workers' compensation claims, is that they couldn't actually find anyone who had a claim actually fully denied and gone through the entire process. So at the end of the day, they ended up coming up with an alternative, a private fund sort of outside the system. And I really think that that was the right way to go, because workers' compensation is one of the things that Connecticut has actually done right. And it really has benefited the employer in terms of lower rates every single year, and it benefited the employee by safer and safer workplaces. So this really was the best outcome for everyone. All right, call centers. I've talked about this a million times in the past at some of these conferences, and I've always warned that it applies to more than just call centers, and that is the case now, even that it's passed. It's really any phone or internet-based customer service, and essentially you need to provide 100 days notice if you're going to move a segment of that workforce out of the state of Connecticut. Is it going to prevent any single call center from leaving the state? No. Absolutely not. But I can guarantee you it will prevent new ones from opening here, unfortunately. So, all right, so we've sort of reached the end of the stuff that I personally don't feel is quite as big of a deal. Are there any questions before we move on to some of the heavier stuff? No, I think most of the tough questions were asked of previous speakers, and I appreciate that. Okay, recalling employees based on seniority. So you just heard about this one as well. This is a bad bill, and I don't like to characterize legislation in that way, but I am going to do it in this case, because in this case of this bill, it was pushed by organized labor, and it has the sole purpose of playing gotcha at industries typically targeted for unionization. You can see up there what it does in the industries and impacted, or if you want more details, look at the last presenter slides. But like, the big problem for me is that it's a gotcha thing. You not only have to send a written letter that you have someone's job now open, you also have to text them. And not only that, but you also have to send them any job that they might be qualified for. So, again, I think that this was really, it's about creating an opportunity to get an employer for making a little mistake, probably unintentional. And I think it's sort of indicative of the issue, or of a growing, I guess, theme that you see in that, the labor committee at the legislature is really trying to create unionized workforces out of non-union shops and make all wages and all benefits equal across the board. And I think that undermines our ability to compete with one another for the best talent. So a couple good things. Obviously, the pool of employees this applies to becomes frozen as of May 1 of 2022. And also, one big problem is, another problem is that the legislature spends a lot of time passing all this stuff, but zero time educating the public that this new requirement is out there, and they leave it up to groups like CBIA to do that. So anyway, this law is already being used as a weapon against some employers. And I'll give you an example. What is one major employer in the state of Connecticut that has billions and billions served, yet few people like to admit that they go there? It is, of course, McDonald's. So just a few weeks ago, McDonald's workers at rest stops in Fairfield County, they were either given the written notice that their jobs were available, but not the text, or vice versa. And so the union came out and said, okay, one, we're going to come after you for retaliation, because you're only not telling these former workers about the job openings that you have, because they were trying to organize everyone there. But easier for them is to just say exactly what, but you also didn't send them the text that you were supposed to send. So now we've really got you. And that's how really bill is going to be used. And of course, once this group of workers filed this claim, the chairpersons of the labor committee immediately came out and said, well, obviously this law is now working, so we should continue this on forever and ever and get rid of that May 1 deadline. And I think you're going to see that effort in the coming year. Sure. Right. So not now, but of course, who knows what effort will be to expand this in the future. So. Okay, and also discussed in the last slide was the data reporting. This may have not have been on your radar until the last couple, or the last speaker. Some additional reporting requirements. It's something that CBIA is going to ask the legislature to revisit in the coming year. Now, this was something that was pushed by both the governor and the Office of Workforce Strategies in the state. And the goal, of course, was to, actually, it was a good goal. It was to get a profile of various industries and start to create a credentialing database in the state. That was the goal and why some of this information was needed. But of course, it's a big burden on all of you out there who are actually supposed to be the ones submitting this information on a quarterly basis. So again, we will be asking them to take a second peek at that one in the coming year. And then salary range disclosure. Again, this one, I know you just heard a lot about it, pushed by organized labor and the Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund. Obviously, it's about pay discrimination. Two sections of the bill. Section 1 is about the salary disclosure. I know that has been dealt with by a couple speakers now. But I can tell you most of the negotiations were actually around Section 2, which was turning the equal pay for equal work to equal pay for comparable work. And as the previous speaker said, this is going to bust the door wide open for discrimination claims. They're going to need the courts to figure out some of the questions surrounding this bill. But it was a situation during the legislative session where I was basically told, look, I can either, by some of the leaders, you can either live with this the way we want it, or you can try to make it a little better. And so we added a few legitimate, bona fide reasons for pay differentials, and also we left the door open by saying, including but not limited to. So there are potentially other things that could be looked at by the courts as bona fide reasons for disparities in pay, and obviously not out there to protect gender-based pay discrimination. So, now, on to my favorite stuff to talk about. This is the last piece of legislation I will cover here today. We're going to talk about some other stuff in a little bit, but this is the last piece of legislation, and I saved it for the end because I think we all like to end our stories with a happy ending, right? So, now, I have had, since the legislative session end, a couple of you express that you felt a little underwhelmed by some of the benefit reforms in this bill. And I get that. And for the last 8 years, I have stood before you at conferences just like this and said, we could solve all our issues in the state if we just reformed our benefits. And I believe that with all of my heart. But it was no longer a practical position to take anymore in this state. I mean, you got to understand how difficult. We've made no traction on that argument over the past years. And you need to understand how difficult it is to negotiate not just against the AFL-CIO and organized labor and legal services on the other side, but also the majority of 187 legislators and one governor all working, all basically not agreeing with your position. And so, we did know we had to do something. And we fought really hard to get where we did here today. And in fact, there was at least one time where in front of my boss, I had to threaten two of the governor's top administrative staffers and the chair of the General Assembly's Finance Committee that I was just going to kill the bill if they didn't move closer to us. Now, I didn't know if I could do that or not, so that was kind of being a little dangerous there, but for whatever reason, it seemed to work. So second, as I said, we just not made any progress on this issue. And once again, look where we found ourselves. We had made so much progress rebuilding that unemployment trust fund. We were about halfway back to solvency goal after being completely broke after the 2008-2009 recession. Here we are. We're in another economic downturn. We had, again, a massive run on unemployment. We were going to borrow, again, $1 billion+ from the federal government to make sure that all of these claims were paid out. And every time we get into this cycle of getting so close to getting digging ourselves out of the red and getting ourselves moving towards our solvency goal, boom, here we are again, another downturn, which just kills our ability to recover, because all of us remember how painful it was to get out of, and all the special assessments, all the stuff that went into the last legislative recession. So we knew it wasn't time to play small ball anymore with just a little bit of benefit reform. We needed to really think big. And I think that the reform package we negotiated is literally the biggest reform to the unemployment compensation system in the history of the program in Connecticut. The biggest reform in the history of Connecticut. And further, I had other industry and trade associations from other states calling me at the end of the legislative session trying to figure out what it is that we did. And Evan, you're nodding your head right there. Evan was one of the people who called me from UTCA, one of our great member companies here at CBIA. So again, it resulted in about $84.25 million in benefit savings alone. So again, if you don't think that this was a great deal, don't take it up with me, take it up with Evan from UTCA. Yeah. So that's a great, we're going to get into that. So let's talk about now the tax side of the equation. We just talked about the benefit side. Let's talk about the tax side of the equation. All right? And you're going to see just on this slide, just as on the previous slide, there's 3 years before this becomes effective. And that's important, and I'm going to save that for sort of the end of the discussion on this slide. So on the tax side. Now, when it comes to state unemployment taxes, there are really only 3 variables that you can adjust. Now, you can adjust the taxable wage base. That's how much of an employee's wages you are taxed on. It currently is the first $15,000 of an employee's wages in the state of Connecticut. Obviously, we push that up. Now, the thing is, the further you push that up, the more you shift the burden of the unemployment trust fund away from low-wage paying businesses to high-wage paying businesses, okay? So, taxable wage base, the higher you go, the more you shift to the core industries of Connecticut, the high-wage payers, okay? The solvency tax. Essentially, this is just a flat tax that all employers pay, and you pay it until your state has reached their solvency goal, okay? So, Massachusetts tried to deal with their unemployment trust fund deficit by jacking that rate way up and not really telling anyone in advance. And now they're digging their way out and doing a whole bunch of stuff to try to get out of that situation. So that's a solvency tax, just a flat tax. Then there's the experience rate. So this rate is based on how much you use the unemployment fund. Now, the broader the range, the more you shift the burden of the fund to the highest users of the unemployment trust fund, so the people who are always taking people on and off unemployment. Now, given those choices, I thought the best thing to do was to not dump it on the core industries of the state, the ones who are paying the best wages to the benefit of people paying the lowest wages. I didn't think really doing anything on the flat tax was going to help us all, so I thought the best thing to do was shift up the experience rate. Now, initially, most people did not agree with me on that. In fact, the governor initially wanted to take that $15,000 taxable wage base and bump that to $70,000. So you'd be paying taxes on the first $70,000 of each employee's wages if they made that much. I hated that approach. So I thought, it's time for us in Connecticut to go after the employers, especially those who employ seasonal workers who are basically subsidized by the rest of us who employ people all year long. And that's kind of where we ended up. And even though we did increase that taxable wage base from $15,000 to $25,000 and then indexed it, 73% of Connecticut businesses will actually see a tax decrease as a result of what we did here today. Now, if you are one of those groups that does employ seasonal workers, I didn't just leave you out there completely abandoned. This doesn't go into effect until 2024. Now, if you do shift the way that you do your hiring and laying people off, shifting more people to the shared work program rather than completely laying them off, you will basically be insulated from a lot of the impact of this bill. So that's what I would suggest to you. You have 3 years to get that going. And so I would highly recommend that to you, and that will save you from these significant tax increases for the most part. So here's just another slide on sort of the impact of the changes. There's also an appendix slide that gives you a couple more examples, not many more, but so unemployment reform is great, but as you just saw, it doesn't take effect till 2024. So what was, we needed some help in the short term. There's no question about that. So I got you a few things to sweeten the pot there as well. So, and it's kind of funny how it happened. So for me, it was very deja vu experience that ended up going the complete opposite way. So back in the 2009 recession, after that, there was a few states that used some state funding to help employers pay for the massive amount of borrowing that occurred as a result of that economic downturn. There were very few states that did it, and I approached the legislature. I got them to raise a bill to do just that, and it went absolutely nowhere at all. And back in, I think it was probably around 2012, 2013 that I had done this. So, once again, thankfully, someone put in a bill this time around and to do the same thing. Let's use either some state funding or some of this federal funding that we keep hearing might come into the state, and use that to help with employers with this massive debt that they're about to shoulder to pay down all of those unemployment claims and help get our fund back towards solvency. So I went in, I testified on the bill, and thought I did a pretty good job. I mean, I don't know. And I had one member company come to me and say, that was really good. We need to make this a huge issue. So I kind of brought that back. I was kicking around with my boss. I was like, what if we just threw a press conference? Let's just throw a press conference, see if we can get any attention around this thing. And I pitched it to a couple other trade associations that I typically work with. And they're like, yeah, let's just throw a press conference. So we did that. We made sure to invite people from both parties to come and testify in support of this, make sure it looked like it was a bipartisan issue, and it really was a bipartisan issue. Next thing we know, this thing's in the budget, and we were all shocked, like, oh my God, we can't believe that actually worked. So at the end of the day, a press conference got us $155 million that businesses will be able to use towards this unemployment debt. Obviously, we think there may even be opportunities to get a little bit more. That's a relatively small amount compared to the billion that we had to borrow, but certainly better than the nothing we got last time around, and maybe will help us get out of the situation we are currently in much quicker. Also did a little clarification on the willful misconduct rule. I know that was one that frequently tripped many employers up, and so I finally took care of that issue that has been on a whiteboard in my office to look at for the entire 9 years I've been at CBIA, and I finally was able to cross that off this year. Equally important as to what did happen was what didn't happen, and this, some of these will certainly be back in the coming year, so we'll be fighting a lot of the same battles again next year. But at the end of the day, this was sort of the agenda CBIA had put out at the beginning of the legislative session, and I think we did fairly well. CBIA's lobbying team spent about 5,800 hours lobbying this past legislative session. We attended 115 public hearings. We testified on well over 100 bills. We killed at least 80 of them. We did a really conservative calculation of what our efforts resulted in terms of savings for employers. And we found out that we saved Connecticut employers an average of $843 per employee from our lobbying costs this past year. So hold your applause till later, don't worry. So I think personally this is an incredible return on investment, and this is a really key reason why you should be supporting CBIA as the state's leading voice for employers at the state capitol. Now, thankfully, all legislative sessions eventually end, and there's also usually a couple special sessions, and that was certainly the case this year. So maybe you wonder what we do other than like this. It's what we've been up to since then. So almost the week after the legislative session ends, we are starting to look at the voting records, putting those together so we can hold lawmakers accountable. So we start right away with doing that. And then it's immediately into preparing our agenda for the next year. So we start with a lot of individual interviews from policy council members, our board of directors, just members we've identified who have been vocal in the past. We do 3 CBIA employees interview that one person for like 30 minutes just to get really drilled down into what things are impacting their business. Then we start surveying CBIA policy council members. I know some of you are on those policy councils, so if you are not a member of CBIA, you should join CBIA and support our efforts. And if you are a member of CBIA and you're not a member of one of our policy councils, please join that policy council. You'll get heads up on all of this stuff way before it goes into effect. You can help us, help you throughout the legislative session, and let us know what's impacting you. It's really they're good opportunities for back and forth on things that are really going to impact your business. So. We hold our public policy council meetings, we develop our agenda, and then ultimately in December they go to a board vote. But I think I just want to share a few little pieces of interesting feedback we're getting from our surveys and conversations. This may not necessarily translate perfectly to a crowd of HR professionals, but as you will see in the next few slides, affordability is really becoming a key recurring theme in the state of Connecticut. I think we did a great job this past session holding the line on taxes, but I think that the next step for employers in the state to really push our economy forward is to start addressing that affordability issue. People in the state want tax relief. Another theme, and of course, that is really resonating with folks is the state's infrastructure. It is something we've dealt with for years. You probably heard the toll issue out there for year after year after year. Now there's this thing TCI that you may hear about anytime you go and you fill your car with gas. You hear a little advertisement about thank everyone for stopping the TCI tax. That's a whole thing too that they're working on. But again, those are some of these are some of the key things that we're hearing in our surveys of our members, which again, it's about a 3,000 member survey that we put out. And again, these are some of the results from that. Here's some of the key priorities that have been identified in those surveys in response to those barriers of growth you saw on the previous slide. These are the big picture priorities for our membership. They continue to come up in our one-on-one conversations that I just told you about. Fiscal stability and taxes continue to be the dominant concern, while workforce and labor issues follow suit. And maybe because of some of the supply chain issues that we're seeing and some of the hiring issues that we're seeing, that maybe even has creeped up even higher since we've got this survey back. I mean, this was out in the field in July and August, so it's a few months old, not real old, but again, we may see that workforce issue is probably even more important right now than anything. And also transportation infrastructure, also a key item. But of course, I think geographic location determines how important that is for a lot of folks. And a lot of the concerns that we're hearing from our membership are also showing up in national rankings. One of the top ones we wait for every single year is the CNBC rankings. Now, thankfully, they didn't do the rankings in 2020, but we jumped 11 spots since the 2019 rankings, which is pretty good. Number 24, I think, right now. Now, I think before we get too far ahead of ourselves, some of this shift may partially be as a result of the way the calculations are done. For example, in infrastructure now, they're now including how much broadband access the state has. Now, Connecticut, that's one of the things we do really well. So I think we got a big jump there. Business friendliness. Now, that's not how legislators treat lawmakers, how legislators treat businesses. This was basically a measure of how we responded to the pandemic. We closed a lot less industries than many of our neighboring states did. But of course, we still are not doing particularly well in some very key things. Cost of living, cost of doing business, they both remain very high. And again, something that needs to be done as part of this overall affordability issue. So